Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to the Week 7 lecture, which is a video lecture, and it's our last lecture of the summer term. Today I'm going to talk about the Q&A in Assessment 3, okay? So in Week 6, you had some work on the presentation aspect, and we talked about that in Week 5 as well, what you need to present and how. And you did do some practice in the Q&A in Week 6, but I'm going to focus a little more about how to do this effectively, how to answer questions from the audience after you give a presentation. Okay, just keep in mind that I'm going to be talking about certain videos here, okay? And what I'd like you to do, and the technology doesn't seem to work very well if I show you the video within Zoom for some reason. So what you need to do is you need to download this PowerPoint, okay? And pause the video when I ask you to watch a video, and then go to the PowerPoint and click on the link and watch the video. They're not long videos. Eh? Some of them are just a couple minutes, some of them are around 5 minutes. So it would help you if you watch the videos, okay? So make sure you do download the PowerPoint if you haven't already, and open it. Okay, so let's start by talking about the purpose of the question and answer in Assessment 3. Okay, and the idea is if you know the purpose of something, of an activity or task, then it can help you to fulfill the requirements, to fulfill the expectations, because you need to achieve that purpose. Okay, so there are a number of them. One is to explore the ideas in your presentation in a deeper way, and this is because you present in only about 5 minutes, right? So there's plenty of space probably beyond that 5 minutes to talk about your ideas, and so the Q&A gives the audience a chance to let you talk more about those ideas and perhaps expand upon them or give more details about them. It also gives you the opportunity to practice the skill and use the skill of thinking on your feet, right? Of answering questions or dealing with issues without any preparation, right? And this skill is quite useful for interviews in particular, okay? Because you don't usually know the questions you'll be asked in an interview, whether they're job interviews or you want to enter a program, so you have to do an interview. So this is a good way to practice that skill. We also want to have another opportunity to assess your critical thinking skills. We want to see if you can apply some critical thinking as you answer these questions. For example, by using hedging or being able to explain your answer with some critical thinking vocabulary, for example, bias or stereotype or logical fallacy or something like that, right? And demonstrate what you've learned. Finally, this is an opportunity for us to assess your communication skills in English. We'll do that in your presentation as well, but you've had some time to prepare your presentation and practice it, hopefully. So it's a little different, right? When you don't have any preparation, specific preparation, and you have to communicate again, on your feet, right? So, we'll pay attention to your fluency and pronunciation and grammar, vocabulary, and how clear you're able to communicate your meaning by answering the questions we ask you. So first question is, how can you perform well in a Q&A? Okay. And because the internet is such a wonderful thing, the first step really is to research and find out. And looking up advice and tips about how to do well in a Q&A session. There's lots of information out there, right? And this is again, this aspect I mentioned in some of the lectures, the idea of learning to learn. Okay, and PolyU really wants you to develop this skill because it's an important one going forward in the future. The information's out there, so can you find it and evaluate the information and be able to use what's good? So here's an example of something I found. Okay, it's an example video on where one person is giving fairly specific advice on how to do the Q&A. And what I'd like you to do is to open up this video and pause the video you're watching now of the week 7 lecture and go to the YouTube video and answer the question. What advice does the speaker give about the Q&A? Okay, so pause this video, watch the video. It's only a couple minutes long, and then see if you can answer the question about the advice. Okay, we're back. Hopefully you had a chance to watch the video and answer the question. And as you might have noticed, this person giving advice emphasizes the importance of using a pause before you answer any question you get after a presentation. And this pause will communicate to the audience that you're a thoughtful person, that you take their question seriously and you're giving it some thought. Okay. And it's interesting that he did mention that depending on the question, you might give a longer pause or a shorter pause. If the question's quite kind of obvious, maybe, shorter pause. But if the question is a difficult one or a complicated one, then a little longer pause is appropriate. Okay, so that's one example of just a quick little video that can give you some useful advice on how to do the Q&A. Here's another one. Okay, so again, pause the video, go to the PPT that you downloaded for the week 7 lecture and watch it and answer the same question. What advice does the speaker give about the Q&A? Okay, pause the video and I'll see you in a few minutes. I think this video is about 5 minutes or so. Okay, we're back. And yeah, so this particular video was giving advice about how to answer difficult questions or questions that you don't really know the answer to. Now, I'm not sure if you're going to come across this in assessment 3 because you are talking about yourself for the most part, right? So I'm not sure they'll ask you a question that you don't really know how to answer, but it's possible. There are different types of questions, as we'll see. And so she gave sort of these 4 techniques, right, that you can choose from in order to deal with a difficult question. The first one is really, right, when you don't know the answer whatsoever, or you've forgotten certain details. And so you promise to kind of follow up, you get their contact information, or say you'll get the contact information after the Q&A, and then you promise to look it up and contact that person. Okay, so this is only if you really have no idea. Redirect, this again isn't always possible, but if there is another person in your group, or if there's someone who knows your work, you could ask them to answer it. I know some speakers will sometimes redirect the question to the person who asked the question and try to ask them, okay, well, what do you think about this before I answer you? But that's kind of cheating, but it is possible, I suppose. 3, the informed guess, taking a stab at it. She used this phrase, based on what I know. So this is where you might have an idea, but you're not sure. But it's good to let them know that you're not sure about it. And then finally, reframing the question. And this is only possible if you really want to check that, did I misunderstand the question? Maybe if I reframe it, maybe if I rephrase it, maybe it's a question that I can answer. So these are some of the techniques you can use, right, when you get a difficult question. And again, an example of a fairly short video that gives you some useful advice. So now pause the video and you try. Why don't you do a quick search, whether it's, on YouTube or some other video channel, or online. You can find articles about Q&A too, and see if you can, come up with some useful information, some useful tips that can guide you in terms of performing well in a Q&A, and specifically in the assessment 3 Q&A. Okay, so pause the video and yes, why don't you spend like 5 to 10 minutes doing this? Yeah, because it'll help you be able to access it later and think about it, and hopefully you'll come up with some useful information and tips. Okay, we're back. And when we're talking about research, another type of research that you can do is to find some example Q&A sessions online, usually on YouTube, right? And then sort of some of them will naturally be quite good examples, but maybe some of them will be real life examples that people have just put up. And then you can look at, what to do. What are some effective things that the person does in the presentation, but possibly, if it's realistic, what not to do, right? What are some mistakes or some areas of improvement for the person in the Q&A? And you can also listen or note down some language that might be useful for you to use in your own Q&A. Okay, in terms of either linking ideas or organizing your ideas or phrases you can use at the start. We looked at this in one of the seminars, right? Is how to give yourself a little time at the beginning to think by using a certain phrase. Okay, so here's another video, and this is an example of a Q&A session by PolyU students, 2 PolyU students. So again, pause this video and go to the link in the PPT and watch the YouTube video and answer the question, how would you evaluate this short Q&A session by first the female student and then the male student? Okay, so pause the video and come back in about 6 or 7 minutes. Right. So hopefully you had a chance to watch that. And as I mentioned, in terms of evaluating the 2 students, if we look at the female student, she does a pretty good job. Okay. Yeah. Thanking the questioner for the question is pretty standard, right? You want to, not everyone is brave enough to ask a question. So you thank them for that. She does answer the question directly, but I feel that it's rather a quick answer and that she could provide some more details to show her expertise, to show her knowledge in this area. I feel it's good she directly answered it, but it would be good if she expanded upon it a little more. Okay. It's interesting that right at the end, she checks if she answered the question. Did I answer the question? Okay. And that's always a good habit, just to make sure that the listener is satisfied, or maybe they have a follow-up question. In terms of her body language, it's good that she smiles. I like that, right? That kind of friendly attitude in a Q&A. But notice that you might have noticed that her hands were folded in front of her throughout the Q&A. And when you use this kind of body language where there's kind of this block between you and the audience, subconsciously and directly, it kind of communicates this barrier, right? And it's not as friendly. So it's much better to have an open kind of posture with your hands at your side where you can use them more freely instead of locked together in front of you. If we go to the male student uses this technique of repeating the question as he answers. Okay, and that's quite a useful way, not only to give you some time to think about the answer, but also to just clarify what you're answering. Okay. I feel that this male student does give a longer and more complete answer and gives sufficient explanation. And did you notice that at the beginning he does say kind of like first, which implies that there's going to be more than one point, that he's going to provide a few kind of ideas in answer to the question, which is, I think, is a really strong way to kind of help you extend your answer, right? Because if you start with first, even if you don't have a second yet in mind, hopefully as you're speaking, and come to the end of your first, a second or even third idea will come to mind, right? So it's a great way to approach this, yeah. and this male student does that. He speaks fluently, you know, without those long pauses or searching for words, and fairly accurately, which is good. So it's quite easy to understand him. And yeah, he does smile, and I think his body language and eye contact are quite good, better than the female students. Okay. So here's another example video, again, of PolyU students. And so pause this video and have a watch. And then again, how would you evaluate this session by the students? Okay, the female student and the male student. So pause the video and have a look. Okay, hopefully you had a chance to watch and analyze the performance of the female and male student in the Q&A. And so this female student, she starts by saying it's a good question. That's fairly common, in addition to thanking the questioner, right? Oh, that's a great question. That's an interesting question. Or, you know, it's a fairly common way to start your answer. She directly answers the question. She gives a technique for reducing nervousness, which is practice, right? But I'd like to see her try to add to that. You know, notice in the previous video, the male student said, well, first, if she had done that, if she said, first, I think you should practice, da, 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 and then she'd naturally provide a second or even third technique. And that would really expand her answer and make it much more detailed and much more satisfactory for the listener, right? I also like that this is a common problem with some students, is especially when they're answering questions from a teacher, is they focus only on the questioner and they ignore the rest of the audience. And the rest of the audience starts to lose kind of attention, right? Lose focus because the speaker isn't paying attention to them. So in this case, the female student does kind of survey the room and look around and doesn't just look, you know, in terms of eye contact with the questioner, which is good. The male student, instead of saying that's a good question, the male student does say, you know, that's an important point that you raised, right? How to answer difficult questions. And notice he does provide more than one way to deal with difficult questions, which helps to make his answer longer and you know, more satisfactory for the listeners. Now, it's interesting, he hands off the question to the female student to finish. So she adds another technique. And this connects earlier with the video, right, where the woman was talking about how to deal with a difficult question. And one of the techniques was to refer the question to someone else. Well, he kind of does that here, which is interesting. Now, in assessment 3, you're going to be alone, so you can't necessarily do that, but it is something to keep in mind, yeah? Yeah, his body language is good. He did use some gestures, but I did notice this male student, he's quite serious, right? And not smiling or anything. And generally, you know, if you can, unless it's a topic that really doesn't, you know, allow for smiling or it's not appropriate to smile, it does help if you can talk to the audience with a more welcoming facial expression. He was quite serious and almost frowning. But on the whole, yeah, all these students have done pretty well, right? Okay, it's just a question of perhaps in some cases elaborating more, explaining more, giving more details, and some body language issues. On the whole, their language was good, their fluency was good, and yeah, definitely some decent examples of Q&A sessions. So again, it's your turn. Why don't you spend a few minutes, okay? Pause the video and do a search online, and especially in YouTube, right? See if you can find some other examples of Q&As and take some notes on what you notice that's good or what you notice that should be avoided. Okay, so pause and yeah, spend maybe 5 minutes doing a search and have an initial look to see if it's suitable, and then you can watch it later, perhaps, as you prepare for the assessment 3. Okay, well, we talked about research as a way to improve the chances that you're going to perform well in the Q&A. And another kind of obvious step, right, is to prepare. Now, some people say, well, you can't prepare for a Q&A because you don't know the questions. Well, that's partly true, but I think there are some things you can do to help yourself through preparation. Now, one of the things is to ask yourself about the possible types of questions and practice answering them by yourself, perhaps at first, right? And when you think about the possible types of questions, it partly depends on your own content, okay? So if you remember when I gave my example assessment 3 presentation in the week 6 lecture, okay, you might recall that one of my experiences, personal experiences that I talked about was about kind of racism, right? Where I treated this African dishwasher rather poorly. And I suppose, right, before I gave that presentation, I kind of suspected maybe that someone might ask me more about this, and specifically about racism, since it is quite an important topic. And I didn't have a huge amount of time to talk about it. And so that's an example where I could think a little more about that incident and what I learned from that incident, and if I've changed and how I've changed, and how do I prevent racism in my thinking nowadays? So this is an example where if you suspect that there are going to be questions after a presentation, you can try to brainstorm either by yourself or with other people possible questions that might be asked based on the content. Okay. Now, one thing that has kind of helped you in this regard is that in the week 6 lecture, we provided you with some example questions. Sorry, not in the week 6 lecture, in the week 6 seminar. And hopefully you had a chance to answer some of these questions as example questions, okay, and had a chance to expand your answers and explain more and communicate your meaning better, right? But here are the 4 questions that hopefully you practiced in week 6. So the first question, would you recommend this critical thinking course to other PolyU students? Why or why not? Second question, how similar or different is this critical thinking course to your liberal studies course in high school? Question number 3, did you come across any similarities between the ideas in the course book and what was presented in the course lectures? And 4, what is one aspect of critical thinking that you need to improve in the future? Okay, so there's a reason why these 4 questions are example questions for the Assessment 3 Q&A. So keep in mind that you might receive different kinds of questions. Some questions might be directly related to your Assessment 3 content, what you spoke about, okay? But there might be 1 or 2 general questions as well. It depends. And these general questions are related to some different categories of questions. And if we look at it now, okay, so the first question is really the category of reflecting on the course itself and the learning that you did and how useful was this learning and things like that. So it's possible you might get a question in the Q&A about your feelings about the course and how beneficial it was for you or stuff like that. Okay, so reflecting on the course. Another category of questions is related to you and your critical thinking before the course, right? So you talked about this a little in your self-evaluation part in the presentation, but it kind of gives you a chance to talk a little more about your journey as a critical thinker based on what you knew about critical thinking before the course and where you are now, perhaps. Okay. A third category is the course book, okay? So remember, this is part of the English reading requirement, so we expect you to read a number of chapters for the course to fulfill that requirement. And Assessment 3 presentation assesses part of that by asking you to refer to the course book in a couple places. But this is another opportunity potentially for us to find out about your reading of the course book is by asking you a question related to the course book. Okay. And finally, the last category of question you might receive is about your future critical thinking and how you might use critical thinking, or what aspects do you still need to improve, that kind of thing. Okay, so the future after this course. So those are the four sort of categories of questions you might get if your teacher asks you some general questions about your experience with the course. And remember, there might also be questions related to the specific content that you presented. Okay. So this is an example where you can do some preparation for the Q&A by thinking about the types of questions you might get and thinking about possible answers that you might talk about. Okay. So another step in terms of performing well in the Q&A is to get feedback. So you've thought about possible questions and practice answering them. So then, you should get some feedback on your answers. You can practice in front of a friend or friends, or you can get together with some classmates before the assessment 3 and just, maybe give your presentation and then ask your classmates to ask you some questions based on the presentation, and you try to answer them, and then they can tell you how well they understood you, or maybe give you some advice. Another option is to use the speaking assistance program before your assessment 3 presentation. And this would give you some practice not only in presenting and getting some feedback on your presentation, but also asking the EL teacher to ask you some questions. You can bring some of these example questions or some other ones you brainstormed, or you can ask the ELC teacher to ask you some questions based on the content of your presentation, right? And so it's really invaluable, and it's free, and you get a whole hour with the teacher. So if possible, if you have time, then go to this link, okay, and book a session either on Friday or sometime early next week. And yeah, I think it'll really help you and potentially give you a better mark because of the feedback that you got from an expert ELC teacher. Okay. So what kinds of feedback might you get or might you ask for? Okay, well, when you give an answer to a question, is it relevant? Have you actually answered the question? Have you provided enough sort of explanation? And this really connects with this idea of expanding upon your answer, not giving a short answer. Yeah. How clear is your meaning when you answer the question? And this can relate to a number of things like grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation. The fluency aspect, right? Were you able to speak without long pauses, searching for words, or frequent hesitations, which can be annoying to listeners? Is that one aspect that you can improve? And yeah, to what extent do you use body language to engage with your listeners? Remember, one of your primary purposes in giving the presentation is to engage with your listeners, with your audience. And this is also true of the Q&A, right? Engaging with your audience is quite important, connecting with them. And body language plays a big role with that. Eye contact and gestures, movement, right, to keep their attention. And of course, I mentioned this earlier, the friendly facial expression, smiling or something like that. So these are the types of feedback that you could ask for or that you might get if you do seek feedback, especially from an expert ELC teacher in the speaking assistance program. Okay, so we're coming to the end, and just to remind you, there are 3 possible steps to help you perform well in a Q&A. One is to do some research about advice and what to do and what not to do in different aspects of the Q&A. The second step is to do some preparation, right? And then practice by, brainstorming possible questions and practice answering them. And then, do some more practice and get some feedback, hopefully from, it doesn't have to be from an expert, but it could help much more, right? If you book an SAP. So finally, let me talk about specifically assessment 3 and how to get a good mark in the sort of Q&A portion. Now, keep in mind, you don't get a separate mark for the Q&A. It's part of the overall mark, but there's certain aspects that will affect your mark. One of them is, of course, answering the question, right? Are you able to understand the question and answer the question? And remember, if you're not sure, you can ask the questioner, usually the teacher, to repeat, or you can rephrase the question just to check your understanding, but do make sure you answer the question relevantly. And then this is quite important to, try to answer each question at some length, because, basically we're aiming for between 3 and 4 minutes. 4 minutes is the maximum. And if you can sort of answer 2 questions in 3 to 4 minutes, then I think you're doing quite well. But if you've answered a couple questions and it's only taken 1 minute total, that's kind of unsatisfactory, to be honest with you. You really need to try to expand your answers. I suppose you'll get another question and you really need to try to answer that question longer. So this is a good rule of thumb. Try to, use 2 questions to take up the Q&A time of between 3 and 4 minutes. Also try to demonstrate that you've learned something in the course about critical thinking. For example, you can use hedging, or, you can try to use some critical thinking vocabulary. I mentioned earlier, like bias and stereotype and things like that. Okay. And in terms of grammar, do be careful of your verb tenses. We mentioned this in relation to your personal experience, right? Using the past tense. A lot of students forget to use the past tense. But this could come up in your assessment 3 Q&A as well. If you're asked about something in the past, do pay attention and use the past tense. And of course, there's other grammar stuff as well and vocabulary stuff. But this is quite a common problem I find with students. And if you can try to practice this and try to, lower the number of errors you make with past tense, I think that would help a lot. Okay, so anyways, that's the end of the week 7 lecture. I hope it was useful. I hope it gave you some ideas and directions in order to prepare for the Q&A in assessment 3. Okay, so good luck with the presentation and with the Q&A.